Does Russell's teapot prove Christian gullibility? Well, maybe, maybe not, but this video certainly does. This is everything wrong with the way that Christians look at the world, and by extension, just about every religion out there, since by and large they're all doing just about the same thing. So here we go again, down the deep dark rabbit hole of religious insanity. When will it ever end? Today, we're going to start on a series of sorts taken from a single video. This video was done by Rationality Rules, at least in part, and while his video was excellent, I'll link to it in the comments, and I recommend you go take a look at it, but there was a lot more to say on the subject, and a lot that he left out that I really wanted to address. I honestly have no idea how many videos this is going to be at the moment. I'm thinking 3, but I could be completely wrong. It's going to be at least a couple. But there is so much wrong here that I think it's necessary to really break this down. So let's go talk about Russell's teapot and how absurdly gullible these people really are. Plus, we're going to do a deep dive into why Christian evidence isn't actually evidence at all, and that's going to take a while. So, strap in and let's get to it.
Over the last couple of weeks, I decided to carve out some time and talk about the burden of proof.
Good. Great subject. One that really isn't talked about nearly enough. The problem, of course, is that most of the time, the religious don't actually understand what the burden of proof is. They can't meet it when it comes to their religious beliefs, so it's off to the end zone so they can retrieve the goalposts and go for a marathon run. We're going to start off with the definition of the burden of proof. Anyone who makes a positive claim that X is true or X is false, anything like that, they have the burden of proof to show that their claim is actually correct. People who do not make a positive claim, people who say, I don't believe you, they do not have a burden of proof to show that their claim is actually true. That's why if you say, I have a dragon in my garage, and I say, I don't believe you, I haven't gained a burden of proof to prove you wrong because I haven't said that you don't. I've only said, I don't believe that you do. Nothing that you've said has convinced me that you're right. Now, keep this in mind moving forward, because he's going to completely ignore this point.
What is it? And more importantly, in debates and regular conversations, do non-Christians or Christians shoulder the burden of proof? The first video caused some consternation amongst some in the atheist community, and so I answered some of their comments in last week's video.
Sorry, didn't see it. Didn't even know your channel existed until now. Therefore, we're not going to address any of that. I might go back and look at that video at some point if my audience wants me to, but at the moment, we're going with what we've got here. The question that we have on the table is whether non-Christians or Christians have the burden of proof. Now, I can't speak for specific instances, but in any case where I am personally involved, it is only the Christian making positive claims. Therefore, only the Christian needs to back it up. I never, ever say your God doesn't exist or that you're absolutely wrong. I will only say, from the best evidence that I've ever seen, I'm not convinced. And I'm very careful to say it that way. I am very careful not to say there are no gods, because we don't know that. I only say that there is no evidence which supports the actual existence of gods. And that part is painfully easy to demonstrate. Now, that doesn't mean that there couldn't be some hiding in a hole in the ground somewhere, but no one should believe a thing is true until there is evidence that that thing is actually true. And in this instance, we just don't have that evidence, at least not that I've personally seen. But anyway, let's let this guy continue.
But Walking down this path, so to speak, and seeing some of the responses, particularly by those who disagree with me, it just brought back this distant memory of something that I was wrestling with maybe 10 years ago now, maybe more than that. It was called Russell's Teapot. Russell's Teapot is named after the famous atheist Bertrand Russell, who, by the way, Bertrand Russell was a massive intellectual for his time.
Now, this is the spot where Rationality Rules really went to town on the background on Russell's Teapot and how Nate here gets pretty much all of it wrong. Therefore, I'm just going to do a lot of fast forwarding in this section because I don't want to have to do all that again. And if you want to see it in context, of course, the link to the original video is in the description below. If you want to see how all of this comes together, go watch Rationality Rules' video because I think you'll enjoy it. Therefore, let's just check in with the chipmunks.
I strongly admire Russell's contributions. His writings, in particular, he was a very smart man. But he came up with this challenge to Christianity that's centered on the thought experiment. Imagine a teapot floating in outer space. What does this have to do with the burden of proof or Christianity at all? I'm going to talk about it in this video. Now stay tuned to the end of the video for an important announcement related to the future of Wise Disciple. Right, now let's jump in. As I mentioned very often, when discussing the existence of God with atheists, agnostics, skeptics, even some Christians, the notions of the burden of proof and supporting evidence are raised. Sometimes atheists and skeptics will say that they don't shoulder the burden of proof because they're not the ones making claims.
Just jumping in here, but that is absolutely correct. Of course, it depends on the individual involved. Anyone making a positive claim does have a burden of proof for that claim, and whether they are an atheist or a skeptic or not, that is the case. I get the sense from a lot of theists, at least in these kinds of cases, that they think that there are separate and distinct rules for the religious and different rules for the non-religious, and that is absolutely not the case. We only need one set of standards, and everyone follows it. It's really not that hard to understand.
Now, this is important to talk about, as good evidence provides a foundation for a reasonable inference on this issue.
I agree, good evidence is essential on virtually every issue. The problem we have comes when one side doesn't understand what good evidence is, and we see that consistently with the religious. We're going to see it again here today, I'm sure, which is why I want to spend some time talking about evidence and about critical thinking, and why the religious are so often not engaging in it at all. But I'll let him get into it, and we'll start pointing out where he goes wrong.
As well as just talking about this idea that those who make claims must support them with some kind of evidence. So for example, if God exists, then there should be some evidence to support claims of his existence. And as Christian case makers continue to show, there are a number of evidences that support the existence of God.
Nope, you're wrong, and demonstrably so. Because here's a little secret you might not know. First off, evidences isn't a word. It's evidence. It's not evidences. You know you're talking to someone ignorant on the subject matter if you hear them using that word. Secondly, though, evidence isn't because I like it. It isn't, well, it sounds good to me, so it has to be true. Your feelings don't matter. That's why I try to specify objective evidence, things that can be reasonably shown to exist in the real world and be demonstrably true, and that logically point directly to the conclusion actually being the case. Remember that last one, because it's really where the religious go completely wrong. Unfortunately, what we see far too often are the religious saying, well, it's got to be evidence because it fits into my worldview. Yeah, that is not going to work, sorry, because your worldview doesn't actually mean anything. Your worldview is just an overlay that you're placing over reality to protect your precious widow fifis. And that's not how reality operates. So you have to have something that anybody can look at, anyone can examine, without having to have any kind of beliefs on it first, and it must point to the facts.
Unfortunately, some atheists believe that there can be no evidence for God whatsoever, and it is from this mistaken presupposition that a particular strategy involving a teapot floating in outer space has emerged.
But that's wrong. There is a difference between can be no evidence and is no evidence. If there was a God, and this goes for any God, not just the Christian version, then there should be evidence that said God is actually there. It should be easily found, easily tested, and easily shown to point directly to an existing deity. The problem is, there isn't any of that. If there was, the religious would be out there carrying it through the streets on their shoulders blowing trumpets. But they're not because it doesn't exist. That's why they turn to philosophical arguments, which we'll get to in a moment, I'm sure. But the fact that this evidence isn't being reported on by every news agency on the planet tells us something about the quality of their evidence. Because they don't actually have evidence. They only have claims.
So the argument goes, we cannot conclusively prove that there is not a teapot orbiting the sun somewhere in outer space. But, given the lack of evidence for such a teapot, its likelihood is so low that the reasonable conclusion should be that it does not exist.
Now, this is getting back into rationality rules territory, so we're going to fast forward a bit after this. But he's simply misunderstanding what Bertrand Russell was saying, as if that's really any surprise. Ultimately, this is an example of what Christians are doing wrong, one of the many, many, many things that they're doing wrong. They are making claims without any evidentiary support. In fact, often they are saying that evidentiary support is outright impossible to have, but they're right anyway. Russell even went so far as to say that the teapot couldn't be detected through any means possible at the time that he wrote it in the early 1950s, just like the Christians do today. It is shifting the burden of proof to say that something is true unless someone else can prove it wrong. That's not how it works. You make the claim, you prove it right, that's how it works. And that's what the religious do all the time. They're shifting this sucker all over the place. The burden of proof demands that it isn't our job to prove you wrong, it's your job to prove yourself right, and they can never, ever, ever do that through, as I specify, objective evidence. And objective is important. Objective means it is not subject to your wishes and your dreams and your feelings and your emotions and your interpretations. It is something that is right there for everyone to see. And they can't do that, and they don't even try. So it's clear he doesn't get it. In fact, it's pretty hard to imagine not getting it any worse than he is. But we do have other things to cover, so let's jump forward a little bit.
Likewise, we cannot conclusively prove that God does not exist, but given the lack of evidence for God, the reasonable conclusion should be that he does not exist. This particular argument originated with philosopher Bertrand Russell in a letter that he wrote in 1958, and here's part of that letter. I do not think the existence of the Christian God any more probable than the existence of the gods of Olympus or Valhalla. To take that illustration, nobody can prove that there is not between the earth and Mars a China teapot revolving in an elliptical orbit, but nobody thinks it's sufficiently likely to be taken into account in practice. I think the Christian God just as unlikely. As Bertrand Russell said his number of decades later, Richard Dawkins commented on Russell's idea in The God Delusion. This is what he said. Russell's point is that the burden of proof rests with the believers, not the non-believers. Mine is the related point that the odds in favor of the teapot, or spaghetti monster, or Esmeralda unicorn, whatever, are not equal to the odds against. So there are a couple of problems that I just want to talk about in the rest of this video with elements in Russell's and Dawkins' comments, all right? First, they both assume that there is no evidence for God.
And this would be the perfect place to present them if they actually existed. And that's the thing. You will find the religious pulling this one all the time. Well, we have evidence. Great. Where is it? Oh, then they'll make a bunch of excuses for why they can't actually present it, but they never actually present the actual objective evidence that they think that they have. Because we constantly ask them for their evidence, and they can never actually come up with any. Instead, they just come up with more claims, more faith, more nonsense that doesn't prove anything, and they act like they don't really understand the problem. Mostly, I think, because they don't. They have no clue what evidence really is. It isn't just anything that makes you feel good. It isn't anything that gets you where you want to go. It's something that points directly to the truth of the claim that you're making in a way that anyone can use that evidence to get to that conclusion without having to hold a belief in it first. It's not confirmation bias, which is what the religious are usually doing. It is a demonstration that the claim is actually true in the real world. And they have absolutely none of that.
At least it seems that Russell's presupposition is that there is no evidence, thus allowing for his analogy. And Dawkins appears to accept Russell's analogy wholesale. Second, Dawkins claims through Russell that since there is no evidence for God, theists are the only ones that bear the burden of proof.
Again, if you have evidence, where is it? The only rational conclusion that we can come to is if you haven't presented it, and they haven't, then it's unlikely to actually exist. Or, at the very least, no one has any access to it, and we can only make decisions based on what we currently have available. The fact that you people are taking your wishes and your dreams and your blind faith and trying to call that evidence, that doesn't make it evidence. We're looking for real evidence, objective evidence, and you still haven't come up with any. Maybe you ought to get on that.
Now, like I said, I've talked about the burden of proof and shouldering the burden of proof in a couple of previous videos that I highly encourage you go check out if you have not already watched those videos. But here's my problem with Russell's presupposition. When an atheist states that there is no evidence for a teapot floating in outer space, he likely means that there is no empirical evidence for it.
Because in any case regarding things that supposedly exist in the real world, that's what's required. If you want to prove that Bigfoot exists, for example, you need to come with a body or some hair or genetic material, something like that, that shows that the real thing called Bigfoot actually exists. Anything that either exists in or interacts with the physical universe, and that is something that your God supposedly does, it requires empirical evidence to back it up. And supposedly, according to you people, that's what your God is. Because if that's not what your God is, then what the hell difference does it make? Meet the standards that exist. Don't make up your own. We'll wait.
In other words, to say that there is no evidence is to say that, as far as we know, no one has seen or touched a teapot floating in outer space. But to suggest that evidence for God is the same thing as empirical evidence for a teapot is to misunderstand the evidence for God typically appealed to by theists.
Which isn't our fault, it's yours. Because what you're appealing to isn't evidence, it's fantasy. It's faith masquerading as fact. You have to meet the standards that exist, and if you can't, we aren't obligated to take you seriously. The failure here is yours, not ours. This is more sprinting around with the goalposts. They're where they are for a reason, because they work. But you can't work with them, and that's why you have to keep playing the victim and playing make-believe that somehow everybody else is doing you dirty because you can't reach where the rational standards already are. And that's sounding distinctly like a you problem, right?
Related to this issue, Dr. Brian Garvey writes this: God is invoked as an explanation for why the universe exists at all, why it is intelligible, why it is governed by laws, why it is governed by the laws it is rather than some other laws, and doubtless many other things.
And this is the screen that I saw that convinced me I had to do this video. Everything that's said here is just wrong. Yes, God is invoked, not observed, not tested, not demonstrated, as an explanation for a whole bunch of stuff that you can't actually show was caused by or affected by any real objectively verifiable God. Those are all just claims. You could erase the word God and just insert anything you wanted. The flying spaghetti monster, invisible, intangible, universe-creating pixies, flatulent leprechauns, you name it, it doesn't really matter. You could just put anything you wanted to in there, and it doesn't change the validity of the statement at all, because the statement has no validity whatsoever. Because when we're asking for evidence, we're not asking what you can invoke, what you can believe, what you have faith in. We're asking what you can prove. Prove it. That's what the evidence does. Unless you can do more than invoke an emotionally comforting claim, you have absolutely nothing. You have to do a whole lot better than this.
So therefore, the evidences for God are the universe. It is the intelligibility of the universe, its physical laws, etc.
Except you haven't proven any of that. This is just, look at the trees, which is stupid. You can't point to a tree and say, this proves God, because it doesn't. It only proves the tree, because there it is. There's the evidence for the tree. You haven't gotten to the evidence for any God yet. You have to do a whole lot better. You'd have to show that an actual, real, existing God somehow made that tree through some demonstrable means that we can examine. Got any of that? Of course you don't. What you believe doesn't matter. What it says in a book of mythology doesn't matter. It's only what you can objectively demonstrate in the real world utilizing verifiable evidence that does. Because again, we can just insert anything that we want in place of God, and it doesn't change anything. You don't get to create a special category for your imaginary friend because you can't meet the rational standards that exist. This is what the religious try to do. And this is why they fail.
So Russell's analogy fails in large part because it likens two different sets of evidences. Evidences for some kind of floating object out in space, and evidences that are effects of an explanation.
A made-up explanation. Now, you might really like that explanation, but that doesn't get you to the truth, only to your own emotionally comforting fantasy. If there really is a teapot out there somewhere floating around in space, then you have to have evidence to support it. Not your wishes, not your dreams, evidence. If there really is a God out there someplace, you have to have evidence to support it. You don't get special dispensation to pretend otherwise just because you are unable to meet the standards that exist. Yet that's exactly what they're trying to do. They have arbitrarily defined their God in such a way where it can't be supported with evidence just because they know they don't have any evidence. But if you don't have any evidence, how do you know that your God is real? How did you make this discovery? And most importantly, how did you test it? Because that's the point that they always go sideways, because they can't test it. They just have to believe it. They're just pretending that they're being put upon by people who are telling them that it just doesn't work that way. Because it doesn't. Meet the standards or stop trying. Nobody is going to take you seriously just because you whine.
Russell's teapot is not an explanation for anything. It simply exists as a rhetorical device. God, on the other hand, is an explanation for a number of things.
No, it's a placeholder for your own ignorance. You want it to be there. It makes you feel good to believe that it's there. Whether or not it's actually there, it's really irrelevant to the religious. But we're not interested in your fee-fees. We care if the thing that you claim exists actually exists. And we have only one method for demonstrating that anything is real in the reality that we all share. Unfortunately for you, your claimed explanation can't meet the standard that has been set up and objectively verified to work, and you're too emotionally attached to it to give it up. So you're just sitting there making fools of yourselves, trying to pretend that you and your magical man in the sky are somehow special and don't have to come up to critical muster. And unfortunately for you, you're just wrong, and you're making yourself look like an idiot.
Now I'll get to why this matters with the burden of proof, so stick with me on this. But with regard to the universe itself, consider the Kalam cosmological argument. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a cause.
And nowhere in that is God even mentioned. Because again, God is just a placeholder for their own ignorance. You can't just fill in God as an explanation for anything that you don't understand. There are all kinds of things that we don't understand, at least not yet, and we might never understand them. Just because that makes you uncomfortable, that doesn't mean that you get to make up an amazing answer that you just yanked straight out of your asshole. That's the point. We're trying to show how you're doing everything rationally wrong, but this isn't rational. It's all about your feelings and your childish emotional state. You just want it to be true, but that doesn't mean anything. Anyhow, let's get through this bit on the kalam, and we'll just call it quits for the day because my brain is already hurting from all of this concentrated stupidity.
Or even, check this out, this is a form of the teleological argument appealing to the fine-tuning of the universe. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. It is not due to physical necessity or chance, therefore it is due to design.
And you have to love premise 2, where it just arbitrarily disposes of the options he doesn't want to believe in with no evidence whatsoever. It just says, well, it's not those things, therefore whatever it is they're trying to get to. That still doesn't mean God designed everything, because you still haven't proven that God is real. That's why these arguments are just so stupid. They're all obviously self-serving. It's like saying the creator of the universe was either God, the flying spaghetti monster, or invisible intangible universe creating pixies. Well, it's not God or the FSM, therefore pixies did it. Now what does that actually prove? Not a damn thing.
In both arguments, here's what I want you to see. In both arguments, a causal agent, namely God, is inferred as being the explanation for the universe, as well as its features.
Says who? When did you ever demonstrate that? Just saying, but I really like this idea, that doesn't really mean anything. This is where we're going to stop for this video because this is getting pretty long and I'm already getting a headache. But really, how stupid do you have to be to really fall for any of this? How deluded are you if you can't see what your religion is doing wrong? This is just believing because you wanna. But that's stupid. This is all just, but God is this. Great. How the hell do you know that? You get deer in the headlights because they don't know. They've never rationally thought about it. It's an article of faith, and they're not used to using their brains for anything of any consequence. These are the questions that they can't answer, so they hide, or they scream and cry, and they kick and throw childish temper tantrums because it makes them feel bad to be questioned at all on these very basic articles of faith. Because they don't care if any of it is actually true. It's all fee-fees and nothing intelligent. I think most of them know that they should care. They know that people are looking at them and saying, well, why are those people so stupid over there? I think they're figuring that out. That's why we see lots of videos like this one where they impotently try to defend their absurd beliefs in the only way that they know how. We're special and we don't have to do what you want. We're the exception to the rule. Except you're not. You need to come up to the standards that exist. You don't get to make up your own. You can't just scream and cry until everybody gets tired of listening to you and gives in. Because we've done that for a lot of years now. And we're done. We just are. You can keep making fools of yourselves if you want, but you're not doing yourselves any favors. You're just convincing more and more people every day that you're as dumb as we've all been saying for years. And that's really not a great optic these days, is it? Maybe you ought to try to do better. Why don't the religious comprehend the actual burden of proof? Actually, why don't they comprehend much of anything? That's the real question that I have, because in the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of theists that we've looked at around here, none of them have proven that they even have the most basic comprehension of the problems at hand. And I guess it won't be any surprise that we're in for more of the same. Today, we're back with Nate Sala, the wise disciple, and honestly, he's not looking very wise, is he? In fact, from where I'm sitting, he's looking like an idiot. This time, though, we continue on with his beliefs that don't turn out to be very well validated at all. He's just preaching to the choir and missing all of the actual reality along the way. And that's kind of sad, isn't it? So get yourself a drink and settle in, because this is going to take a while, working through all of the ridiculous religious nonsense.
This does not mean that God is like a physical object floating in space like a teacup. It just means that God is an inference to the best explanation.
Except it's not. Now, you might think it's a good explanation based on your own religious indoctrination and religious wishful thinking, but it's nothing of the sort. The religious love to pretend that God explains everything, but it actually explains nothing. It's like saying invisible, intangible, universe-creating pixies did it. Yeah, but that doesn't mean that they did it. That doesn't mean anything, and neither does God. Just because you really like the idea, that doesn't mean anything. And this is exactly where we have to start asking all of those difficult questions. Why is this the best explanation? Why is it even coherent? Because it's not remotely likely to be factually correct. You can't defend your claim with anything remotely resembling objective evidence. Now, maybe he might get to that in a second. I don't know, we'll see. But in all of the years that I've been talking to the religious, including an awful lot of years when I was religious myself, I have never seen a single good answer to that. Maybe I'll be surprised here, but wouldn't be holding my breath.
Considering God as an explanation for the universe, as well as considering like the universe as evidence for God, Dawkins' comment on the burden of proof needs to be reevaluated, in my opinion.
Nope, you're just wrong. You don't get to declare something a good answer just because you came to it emotionally. In fact, that's probably the worst reason imaginable. You come to solid solutions because that's where the evidence leads. Your fifis mean absolutely nothing. And this is exactly why the religious get so confused when the atheists laugh at them. Because they can't imagine looking at reality any other way. They are only looking at it through the preconceived lens of their own religious worldview. And they can't figure out what's wrong with that, but it is. They just want to be happy, and whatever makes them happy, no matter how unsupported or absurd it might be, well, that's just got to be the truth, because it makes you feel good. But that's just stupid. We're always going to come back to this because your feelings mean absolutely nothing. Nothing at all. What matters is the evidence. What matters are the facts. How that evidence and those facts make you feel is completely irrelevant. You just have to grow the hell up. But I don't think you ever will.
Whether or not Russell's floating teacup actually exists is irrelevant to the universe. Like I said, his teacup is not an explanation for anything.
Whether the idea of God makes you happy or not is irrelevant. It means absolutely nothing. And I know I have to keep saying this because I'm hoping that sooner or later it's going to get past that thick block of religious nonsense stuffed in your head. Something is only an explanation if it can be shown to be actually so. Now, prove that to be the case for God. No faith, no fifis, no wishes and dreams. Where is your evidence? Your direct and demonstrable evidence that points directly to a real existing God. Come back when you've got some, because until that, you're getting nowhere.
So One's worldview of the universe is not devoid of explanation if Russell's teacup does not exist.
And there's that worldview crap again that I was just talking about. So far as we can tell, so far as we have any objectively verifiable evidence to support, we all live in the same universe. Therefore, having an emotionally comforting overlay that you've just draped over reality so that you can feel better, that doesn't actually answer any questions, at least not realistically or reliably. The answers are whatever the answers are, and having a worldview to color your judgments, that's just idiotic. It's like going into a courtroom and testifying that the butler did it. I mean, you weren't there, you didn't see anything, you don't even know if they have a butler, but your worldview says that the butler always does it, and therefore the butler did it. How much credibility do you think the court is going to give your story? Absolutely zero, exactly as much as your Christian worldview deserves. It's really too bad that you people can't get that through your heads.
However, if God does not exist, there must be another explanation for the universe and its particular features. And see, now I'm getting to the heart of the issue. It's right here.
No, you're about to miss it entirely. There is a difference between there's got to be an explanation and we know what that explanation is right now. Just because you really want to know, that doesn't mean that you do. And that's why they just invent these farcical gods to explain away the things that they have no other explanation for, because they really want to understand in a way that's emotionally comforting, so therefore they just make crap up. Unfortunately, once we really do find explanations, they're so emotionally attached to their God claims that they'd rather stick with that instead of changing it to the actual truth. Like I keep saying, they just don't care. They're mad when somebody notices what's going on, but the truth remains the truth whether they like that or not. And that's kind of sad, isn't it?
In contrast to the Christian who proposes the Christian God as the explanation for the universe and its properties, atheists and skeptics who challenge Christians are doing so from the position that something other than the Christian God is the explanation.
We're the ones telling the truth, at least to the best of our ability. We don't know, and neither do you. That's kind of the point. What's really going on here is like hearing a sound in the woods and proposing with absolutely zero evidence and support that Bigfoot is to blame. Why Bigfoot? Because you really like the idea. Except the reality is you don't know what caused the sound. You're just uncomfortable admitting that you don't know, so you're just making something up that sounds good to you. They can't admit it because it gets in the way of their feelings, and that's really what this is all about. And that's why they really get upset when we ask them to walk us through their thought processes and explain to us how they reached that conclusion. Show your progression. Present your evidence. If you can't, then your idea is empty and pointless. You don't know, and you have no good reason to suggest a credible solution, just because you really wish that you did. Because that's not how critical thinking works.
And they do that because they attempt to disprove Christian arguments and conversations and debates, and because they conduct their lives in a manner as if the Christian God does not exist.
And these are the bald rationalizations that they go through so they can try to save face. The problem is never them, it's always somebody else. Nobody ever acts as if God doesn't exist, because there's no reason to think that God does exist. They can't admit that they might be wrong. This is what fanaticism looks like, and it's not something to be proud of. It's why reason and rationalization are not remotely the same thing. It's sad that so few people actually realize that, but it remains the case.
That's their position on this issue.
No, it's not. That's your rationalization, so you don't have to face the very real possibility that you're just wrong. It's never your fault. It's always somebody else. The idea of God makes you happy, so that's got to be true. These are the problems with your side because you're not actually putting your own beliefs to the test. You're just demanding that you're right because you really want to be right. And I'm sorry, but it just doesn't work that way.
So the idea that atheism it's a passive enterprise. You know, there is no claim. We're not making any positive claims here. That's misleading. This is a position that trades on the proposition that reality is explained by other than, okay, something other than the Christian God.
If that's the case, then that applies equally well to every other religion out there, doesn't it? And if you think about it, Christianity is just doing the same thing. It's just saying that the explanation is something other than other gods. It's amazing just how blind you people actually are to your own problems. Now, I'm not saying that the sound in the woods must have been made by something other than Bigfoot. I'm asking how adherents rationally got to the conclusion that it was Bigfoot, or in your case, God, and I'm asking for their evidence in support of their beliefs. Because if you don't have any, then I have no reason of any kind to take your claim seriously at all. I'll go back to saying, I don't know, until evidence actually comes along. Maybe you ought to give that a shot, because it'll make you look a whole lot more rational.
So really at base, both theists and atheists are looking at the same evidence, right? The universe and its features, and drawing two different conclusions.
We're looking where the evidence leads, and you're leading the evidence. That's the difference. You've made up your mind what your ad hoc explanation is going to be for entirely emotional reasons long before you ever got anywhere remotely close to the evidence. You want there to be a God. We're asking how you got there and pointing out that you didn't actually do so rationally. Rational people start with the evidence and examine it until it suggests an explanation. You're starting with the explanation that you happen to like, and then you're cherry-picking the evidence and twisting it until it gets you where you want to go. You are just doing it wrong. Maybe you ought to figure that out.
This is why I've said before, both theists and atheists should take turns shouldering their own burden of proof.
Atheists do, because we're not the ones making any claims. I mean, most of us at least, since I can't generalize like that, but most atheists that I'm aware of, they aren't saying that there are no gods. And for the ones that do, I'm absolutely going to say that they have a burden of proof, because they do. We're asking the people who are saying that there are gods how they came to that conclusion. We're asking you to prove it. If you could prove it, then I'd change my mind. I'd become a theist again because you had actually proven your case. Because that's what being a skeptic is. It's about withholding rational assent until the proposition has been objectively demonstrated. So go ahead, demonstrate it. Of course, the religious, I think they know they can't back up their side. The best they can do is stand there like a 6-year-old screaming, "You're doing it too!" But that doesn't actually get you anywhere. Okay, even if that was the case, I mean, it isn't, but even if it was, then you'd still have to back up your own claims with evidence. Go ahead. Making excuses doesn't remove your own burden of proof. Show how reasonable your claims actually are with objective evidence, because we're waiting. But the only reason that they're pulling any of this is because they figure that if they make a straw man of atheism, people will stop asking them to put up or shut up. And guess what? That's not going to happen. Worry less about what the other side is doing and do what you are rationally required to do. Get to work. We'll wait.
And see, that's not the only problem with this kind of issue. There's another problem. And this other problem is the way that some folks view science. And now I want to zoom in on something called methodological naturalism.
Now, this is where rationality rules cut the video, but I'm going to go on because I figure he's going to get just about everything wrong here, so we might as well take a look at it. Most theists do, after all, so it's not hard to imagine. As we know, they love to think that everyone else is just like they are. Everybody has faith, everybody believes based on their emotion, and everybody just BS's their way to an emotionally comforting conclusion. This is not the case, though, and we're going to prove that going on. This is just a worldview getting in the way, and I figure he's going to get everything wrong because he hasn't gotten anything right yet, but I guess we'll see. This is just completely unknown territory from here on out, and I'm going in.
Methodological naturalism is a term that refers to the method of scientific study that only seeks to answer questions from within the physical universe.
That's because it's the only thing that we have any actual evidence for. See, science is a methodology. It's a way of examining things. We do so by looking at the evidence that we have at hand and trying to work out how things operate based on that objectively verifiable evidence. Once we have the evidence, once we have ideas, then we put them to the test repeatedly and consistently. So far, at least, we have no evidence of anything beyond the natural, which is why we only accept that there is the natural. This is not a conspiracy. This is based on the evidence. I know you really wish that we could find evidence for the supernatural, but too bad. We haven't done that. If you'd like to actually present some evidence or a new methodology which can be demonstrated on the same level as science, we'd love to hear it. Go right ahead. What you're trying to portray here as a weakness, it's actually a strength. It keeps people from being bamboozled by religious crap. And it's not just the religious, but all manner of pseudoscientific nonsense. Because you're not the only ones trying to do this. You're just the most successful con out there. But there are others who are trying to suggest all kinds of magic, woo-woo idiocy that cannot be validated or verified in any credible way. You're just unhappy that we're exposing your scam and your gullibility. And that sounds distinctly like a you problem.
And when it comes to everyday scientific study, methodological naturalism is a great tool. It gives us lots of insights, okay? The problem, though, with this method is that it's insufficient to study all of science.
Well, there are things that are, by definition, theoretical. That's where we have a difference between a hypothesis and a theory, between a guess and a fact. And I'm willing to bet that he won't understand that either. Most theists don't. So get to it, Nate. Let's see how well we can read you. Because I'm guessing it's probably pretty well.
Because science proper is bigger than what I think a lot of people realize it is. Forensics is a science. Archaeology is a science. Psychology is a science.
And all of those things rely on evidence. I don't think your point is as good as you're trying to pretend that it is. All of them look at the facts that we have at hand and make determinations based on those. Now, there is a difference between a hard science and a soft science. History, for example, is a soft science. It takes the few sources that we might have available to us, and it tries to piece them together as best as it can. And that's not hard science. It's a bunch of, at best, educated guesses, and trust me, I've seen plenty of armchair historians getting really emotionally invested in their conclusions, to the point that, as the religious do, actual reality and new evidence becomes utterly irrelevant when it challenges their ideas.
So far, I haven't said anything controversial yet. But what makes these fields of science different from other fields like biology or chemistry or whatever, it really centers on agent causation and event causation.
Nope. Now, I'll let him get to what he means by that, but I don't see that, to be honest. It seems to be getting back to what he wishes was true, and I've seen plenty of that, even beyond religion. If anyone remembers the videos and posts that I did on moral realism, That's all wishful thinking with zero evidence presented in support. It's just gotta be true because, fifis. And I think we can talk about history again here because it might make things more clear. We only think that the Trojan War happened today because we found actual physical evidence to support it. It left the Homeric epics and became archaeological fact. No credible historian is going to argue that that proves that the Greek gods and goddesses are real, though, just because they appear in the stories. Any who did has left the realm of science and entered the realm of fantasy. And this is exactly what Christians and other theists are doing. They are emotionally invested in the ideas that they have, more so than whether or not those ideas actually mean anything in objective reality. But I'm willing to let Nate explain, so let's get back to the video.
Agent causation typically refers to events that take place that are caused by human beings or agents. Event causation refers to events that take place that are caused by another event, and that event is caused by a prior event, and so on and so on.
So, what causes quarks exactly? These aren't caused by any agents, nor any previous events that we can tell. They just seem to happen. In fact, most of quantum mechanics seems to just happen, and we don't at the moment understand why. Spooky action at a distance, as Einstein would say. Now, it's very likely that we just don't understand yet, and if we keep looking into it, we may or may not figure it out in time, but that's also a problem that the religious have. They think that they already know everything right now, or that they want to know everything right now, and in the absence of actual demonstrable answers, they can just make things up because it makes them feel better. They can't accept that we only know the things that we know in the moment, and anything that we don't know, we don't know. It becomes a problem because they can't differentiate between wanting to know and actually knowing. They just really want to believe.
So think of it like this. In forensic science, when a homicide detective walks into a crime scene and must determine what happened, like how the victim died, who killed the victim, all that stuff, they're going to use science, but they're going to do so in a way that incorporates agent causation into their determinations and solve the crime.
Not necessarily. What if it was an accidental death? What if it was natural circumstances? Only by investigating the case can they make those determinations. Maybe nobody was to blame. Maybe no crime has been committed. Of course, these examples are painfully easy to take apart, which is why J. Warner Wallace is such a joke, because they're so focused on getting to the conclusion that they like that they can't consider anything else along the way. Now, I know that I'm just nitpicking here, but we really have to. So anyway, let's get back to Nate and see where he goes from here.
Gunpowder residue on the victim's own hand doesn't just magically appear out of nowhere. It wasn't due to a prior event and then a prior event and then another prior event that had nothing to do with agent causation. It got there because the human agent, in this case the victim, used his own agency to cause the gunpowder to attach to his hand.
Again, not necessarily. If you put your hands down on gunpowder or any other loose substance, it tends to stick. No agency required. How many times have you been just out walking around and you look at your hand or your arm or whatever and there's dirt or a smudge or something and you've got no idea how it got there? That kind of thing happens all the time. This is just an example of non-critical thinking because he's assuming things about the scene that may or may not be true because he's trying to get to a specific conclusion. Just because there's a butler, it doesn't mean the butler did it.
That's why a lot of folks say guns don't kill people, people kill people, right? And now half the audience just got triggered.
Only if you're an idiot.
Here's what I'm saying. The gunpowder got there because the victim actually pulled the trigger on himself.
Getting tired of saying this, but not necessarily. Now, I know I'm getting really pedantic here on purpose, because he's trying to make a point without considering all of the options, because he's desperately trying to get to a specific position because he wants to. Apparently, he hasn't watched many detective shows, because there's tons of them where the victim had gunpowder on his hand or his fingerprints were on the gun, and he wasn't the one responsible. Hell, the victim could have pulled the trigger and it didn't fire properly and he had a heart attack, something like that. You can't just leap to conclusions without actually examining all the evidence that you have, and that's really where he's going wrong. Hopefully, he's about done with this so we can just get on to an actual point, but if this is how he's operating, I'm not feeling that confident that he's going to manage it successfully.
And when the gun fired, the gunpowder residue went all over his hand. And congratulations, we solved the crime. It's not a homicide, it's a suicide. That was depressing. The point is, forensics, archaeology, psychology, these are all sciences that incorporate agent causation.
And in every single one of them, the agents are demonstrable. You can prove they exist. Now try doing that with your imaginary friend. Again, we have to go back to what they're claiming is evidence and why it's not. So let's compare this to his suicide example. You have a body, you have a gun, and you have gunpowder residue. Even if we just ignore all the other possibilities to make things a lot simpler, you have things that you can objectively study to find out the truth. Now, how exactly do you do that with a god? And this goes for any god, not just Nate's. It's one thing to say that something created the universe. I don't know if that's a defensible position or not, but you can still say that. So what is this something? Well, it's God. But how did you get there, and how do you prove it? Why is it the Christian God and not a Hindu God? Why is it the Christian God and not something that we've never even imagined? Here's where they tend to leap to faith, but faith doesn't actually mean anything. You can no more use faith to get to God than you can use faith to get to the butler did it. You need something that points directly and demonstrably to your proposed cause, and you don't have that with gods. You don't have that with any gods. I don't care what it is that you want to be true. You have to be able to prove it, and the religious simply can't.
Now check this out, okay? Because this is very important to understand. When you do not incorporate agent causation into your investigations, and you happen to be investigating something that entailed an agent's actions, right? Like shooting a gun, what's going to happen is you're going to have a gap.
No, because again, we can find more exceptions to his supposed rule. I was just cleaning the gun and it went off. It fell off the wall and it went off. It has nothing at all to do with intentionality, and thus nothing at all to do with agency. Even though we have an agent involved, it has nothing at all to do with that agent. It was just physics doing what physics does. This is where we run into problems when we start looking for things that aren't necessarily there, and this is all too common. It's why you don't start off with an emotionally comforting conclusion before you've ever even looked at the evidence. You tend to come up with bad ideas because you're desperately trying to get to where you want to go instead of to the truth. And there is a gap, as I said, between faith and fact. But I bet he wouldn't want to talk about that, would he?
And now other people in the audience just got triggered. Again, going back to the gunpowder example, if you notice as a scientist that there are two consecutive states of affairs, one where the gun has not been fired, and the other state of affairs where the gun is fired and gunpowder is now all over the victim's hand, and you have committed yourself to the idea that agent causation cannot be included in your investigation, you now have a gap between those two states of affairs.
Just as if you've concluded before you even looked at the evidence that there is agent causation, and in fact your God is the agent involved, then you have that same gap. Now, this is something that I see a lot, and it isn't just a religious problem. There are a ton of people out there who are so blinded to their own blind faith that when they're criticizing others for doing a thing, they can't see that they themselves are doing the exact same thing wrong themselves. You know, groups that get mad because your side is doing X while entirely ignoring the fact that a couple of years ago, their side did the exact same thing. Then you get the left screaming at people saying that Biden is not their president when,
Donald J. Trump is now president of the United States. President Obama is the ex-president. And Mr. Trump, for the moment, steps loose in for the inaugural address.
What a great honor to be able to introduce for the first time ever anywhere the 45th President of the United States of America, Donald.
Tap on the shoulder. You adjust the microphone as you talk, man.
And maybe as a methodological naturalist, you tell yourself, well, you know, one day science will explain what really happened. I mean, so science has been doing such a great job in the past. I mean, look at it. So, right. So we'll have that answer soon. Yeah, the problem is not science. The problem is methodological naturalism can't tell you what happened.
And how do you know that? Oh, I know you have faith, but fuck your faith. Your faith doesn't mean anything. Here's the problem. Never once in the entire history of reality has naturalism ever not been the answer once we've found one. Now, there are certainly things that we don't know, things that we might never know, but the track record for religion really isn't good. They haven't been demonstrably right yet, and whether they like it or not, one thing is always going to be true. The time to believe any given proposition is when you have evidence to support it. Actual evidence, not the wishful thinking and confirmation bias that you people are offering, not the hopes and wishes and dreams that you people want to be true. Actual evidence. If we don't know, we don't know. That doesn't mean God did it, at least not until you can prove that God did it. Directly, demonstrably, evidentially, prove it. That doesn't mean running around, waving your arms, making excuses for why the evidence doesn't support your side. Pony it up, or stop believing it, or look like an idiot. Those are really your only options. Let us know which one you prefer.
It will never tell you what really happened because it does not take agent causation into account. Now, here's the reality. In the history of science, it was common for scientists doing excellent scientific research to believe in God. They believed that the universe was structured with a certain order because there is a God who structured it and gave us the kinds of minds to understand, to some degree, the structure and the order to the universe.
And that doesn't really happen anymore, you notice. The overwhelming majority of scientists, especially in the hard sciences, they're atheists. 93% of the National Academy of Sciences, remember? That's not to say that you can't be a Christian and a scientist, or a Muslim and a scientist, or anything else. You can. But that requires compartmentalization. You take the science stuff and you put it over here, and you treat it one way, and then you take the religion stuff and you put it over there, and you treat it completely different. The two sides never get to cross. You can't use the science to evaluate the religion, and you don't use the religion to evaluate the science, at least not if you want to make any sense. If you do that, you become a laughingstock, and there are people out there who do. It might not have anything to do with religion, but look at Michio Kaku these days. And that's not because the overwhelming majority of scientists are atheists, but it's because your conclusions and your contortions required to get there make your science absurdly fallacious. It doesn't actually work. But yeah, go ahead, Nate. Why don't you just finish up for the week so we can all take a break? Because this is way too long for a single video. And I say that knowing what's coming up on Thursday.
Even today, there are scientists that believe in God. Are these folks doing actual science? Yes, they are doing actual science. So because of that, and because scientific fields of study do not rely on methodological naturalism only, then methodological naturalists shoulder a burden to support their claim that this is the way to study the origin of the universe and to debate the existence of God.
No, they only have to support their own ideas, which they do with actual evidence. You know, that stuff you people don't have. This is where the religious tend to go very, very, very wrong. You can be like the Discovery Institute or the Institute for Creation Research, and you can claim that you're doing science. Unfortunately, that's all it is. It's a claim. Their ideas don't get published in mainstream scientific peer-reviewed journals where actual reputable scientists look at their work. It doesn't stand up to critical rigor because they aren't doing actual science. They're just shoehorning God did it into everything without any evidence of any kind. The Kitzmiller trial proved that the best that the Discovery Institute could come up with failed laughably under any kind of rational evaluation. And if you want to see someone taking apart creationism regularly, check out Viced Rhino's playlist looking at Answers in Genesis Canada. They're really, really crap at this, because your claims don't actually mean anything. Only your evidence does, and they don't have any of that. This is what happens when you do research with a goal in mind. You cherry-pick ideas and half-ass your investigation because you stop when you're satisfied that your backers are going to be happy with what you say. And that's the thing about science. It's not there to cater to parishioners. It's there to find the actual truth. It doesn't care if anybody's happy. It only cares if they've reached the best conclusions that they can based on the evidence that they have. And it's really too bad that the religious don't care a bit about any of that, do they? Anyway, we're going to finish this up next time, and I promise it's going to be a shorter video. At least, I hope it is. I'm not quite there yet. Anyway, do you think that Nate is doing a good job here, or is this just as painfully absurd as it seems to be? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because I'd really like to know your take. Are Christians gullible? Duh. But there are some of them, not a lot mind you, but some who at least put some work into thinking about the things that they believe. But only the parts that aren't completely faith-based. Those never get any effort at all. Let's look at more of that today, because it's no more impressive now than it ever has been. We're on to the very last video with Nate Sala complaining about not being taken seriously by science. Well, maybe that's because you're not doing science. It's always an excuse for why it's not really your fault, isn't it? And that's hardly a surprise. This is also not going to be as long as the last couple of videos for reasons I'll go into later. I'm sure that's going to come as a relief to some people after the last one, which was really long. So, can Nate bring it home and prove that he's a wise disciple after all? Let's dive right in and see.
Then methodological naturalists shoulder a burden to support their claim that this is the way to study the origin of the universe and to debate the existence of God. That what everyone should be doing when we evaluate metaphysical issues is to only utilize naturalistic methods.
Well, that started right in the middle of a thought, didn't it? Now, these things get cut up pretty much arbitrarily because I realize just how long it's getting and I just want to stop. So, if you remember the last time, he was talking about methodological naturalism, and he's assuming that science just arbitrarily picked the natural world as its guide, probably with some crazed conspiracy theories mixed in. However, that's not it. The natural world is all that we have ever had any evidence for. We're not picking it arbitrarily, we're going where the only evidence that exists points. Going back to an example that I've used throughout these videos, just assuming that the butler did it, that doesn't really work if there isn't a butler. But the butler had to do it. But that doesn't make any sense. The natural world has been proven. If you want us to accept the supernatural, then you have to prove that too, to the same degree as we've already done with the natural. And you'd better get on that, because just because you really like the idea, just because you like flapping your lips and talking about it, that doesn't mean anything. You have to back it up with evidence, not rely on your own ignorance. So let's get back to it.
And so now we're back to the conversation about shouldering burdens. Are we really interested in having difficult and thoughtful discussions about the existence of God? Or does one side just want to make the other side do a bunch of work?
You have to do the same work to back up your claim that we've already done. The problem is, science has been at this for centuries, and you're just getting started. You have all of your work ahead of you to do. Unfortunately, we know from experience that the religious aren't interested in doing any actual work. They just want to believe. And that's why when we point out that they have a lot of work to do, they just make excuses. Where's your evidence, we ask? It's in the Bible. That's what they inevitably respond. Well, how do you know that the Bible is true? Faith, of course, but faith isn't a valid way to look at the world and gain any demonstrable insight. That's what we're looking for. Demonstrable. You have to prove it actually happened the way that you describe, and they simply can't do that. Until they can come up with a way to show that their claims are factually correct, something that they're not even trying to do, we have no reason of any kind to take them seriously. They want us to change the methodology to make it less coherent so they can slip their theology in. No thanks. That's not going to happen.
If we want to say one side should do all the work and that side should be the Christian theist, then that in itself should be its own debate.
Nope. Because, like I said, we've already done our work. Now it's your turn. But you're trying to get out of it by claiming it's not fair. Well, I don't know where the hell you got the idea that life was fair, because it's not. Either put up or shut up. It's really not that hard.
Here's a resolution for that. Methodological naturalism is the only legitimate method to evaluate the existence of God. A lot of people are going to immediately recognize a category error in the mix, but whatever. I mean, go after it and make it your own, right? Make your case.
We have. Now, if you'd like to present some other demonstrable methodology for examining the supernatural, feel free. We'll look at it on its own merits. Yet, that's never what the religious do, right? How do you know that the supernatural exists? We just do. Well, how do you test for it? We have faith. That's not a test. That's just an assertion, and science doesn't work by assertion. If you want science to take your unsupported claim seriously, you have a couple of questions to answer. What is the supernatural? Not what it's not. What is it? What's it made of, and how does it operate? What specific rules does it follow, and how do you know any of that? Most importantly, though, how can we test for it objectively to see if you're right? If you can't come up with that last one, especially the last one, you've lost, because nobody gives a damn about your claims. We care about your proof. Got any? I didn't think so.
But guess what? That debate is not taking place, as far as I can tell. No, instead, the claim is just thrown around there by some folks. They just go, well, this is the way it should be done. You know, some folks try to say it like this: because this is the way we investigate other things, this is the way it should be done. When we talk about God, we need to do it this way.
Then feel free to propose your own system that can objectively demonstrate that God is real. because we've been asking for that for centuries, and you know what we've gotten in response? Crickets. Excuses. You can't put God to the test. It says so in the Bible. But I don't care what your stupid book says. If you want me to accept that your deity is real, you need to come up to my standards. I am not going to go down to yours. Virtually every religion says this, because virtually every religion, at least the theistic ones, realize eventually that they have to shelter their imaginary friends from real-world investigation. If they allow people to check to see if their gods are real, then people are going to stop shoveling money into their churches because people are going to realize what a massive scam it all is. Nobody's going to just believe. And if that's what your requirement is, you've already lost. So figure out if you want to be credible or if you just want to believe. It's all on your shoulders. Make the call and stick to it. Get back to us when you've made up your mind, because you can't have it both ways.
Except, I just pointed out, that's not the way all of science is done. The bottom line is, I think all kinds of debates should take place, and I think sometimes Christians should shoulder the burden of proof. They should make their case in support of the resolution, and the negative team should go after them hard. But for all the reasons I just offered, laying out the definitions in the previous videos about presumption and the various burdens in debate, now you know a little bit more about why I said it's absolutely appropriate for non-theists to also shoulder the burden of proof.
Now, I don't know if you remember the last video, but I pointed out that all of his examples were agent-based things and nature-based things. That's not exactly how he put it, but you get the basic idea. All of them relied on things that could be demonstrated to exist first. We don't believe that the unicorn butler did it. You'd have to show that there was a unicorn butler first. Well, there really is, but it's just invisible and completely undetectable. You have to have faith that it's there. Yeah, no, go away. You are not going to impress anybody with your faith-based nonsense, whether you're talking about unicorn butlers or gods. This is right back to bald rationalizations. It's ignoring the obvious problems with their side while making up empty excuses for why they think everybody else is to blame for their own failures. This is not how adults work, but this is how the religious work, isn't it? Why can't they get that through their heads?
Now you know why I've also said in the past, like with regard to the God of the Gaps controversy, Christians are not the ones who created those gaps. In order to challenge the Christian worldview, you have to adopt presuppositions that themselves need to be discussed and debated before they are adopted. And before we can actually get into a meaningful debate about God's existence, you need to talk about that first.
And you're still wrong. You are the one proposing things without evidentiary support. It's not us, it's you. When we point this out, you just make excuses and feign anger that you actually have to present something that we all know that you can't present. Then you just change the subject. We're not assuming anything. We're asking that you present anything that you have objectively verifiable evidence for. You're the ones arguing for something completely different, something entirely without credible proof, and you're trying to pretend that somehow this is something that we're doing wrong. No, that's you. Either meet the standards that exist or demonstrate why those standards should change. Your fifis don't mean a thing. You have to do a whole lot better than you're doing, and I don't understand why you aren't. So why don't you figure it out and give it a shot, and we'll all sit here and wait. This is apparently going to be a much shorter video because he spends the last 3.5 minutes on channel business and making money because, of course he is. Now, that's fine and all, but because I don't watch these videos up front, I had no idea that his 18-minute video was actually 14.5 minutes long. So let's take a couple of minutes to discuss where Nate and others like him go completely wrong. First, they have no demonstrable methodology for their beliefs. You just have to believe. But can't the same thing be said for any woo belief? You just have to believe in Bigfoot. Why? Because you have to have faith. But faith isn't a demonstrable answer to anything. That's just wishful thinking, and so long as that's all that Christianity is, and that goes for any religion or Bigfoot belief or anything else, then they'll continue to be an irrational laughingstock because nobody ought to believe like that. Nobody cares if that hurts your feelings. It's still the case. They are looking for a way to be on an even footing with science without comprehending why science works the way that it does. It doesn't operate on faith. It operates on demonstrable facts. And when science asks the religious, well, where are your facts? They've got nothing at all to present. Of course, they can't admit that, so they run around with the goalposts and blame science for being just too hard for the religious to deal with. Well, of course it's hard. It's supposed to be hard. Only the very best ideas can qualify. That's kind of the point. The one thing they never ask themselves is why religion is just so bad at it. They don't understand why science works the way that it does, and let's be honest, they don't really care. They just want to be seen as a credible option, whether they actually are or not. This all comes down to fee-fees like everything else in religion, and Nate here is essentially asking, why don't you make an exception for us? Because you haven't warranted it. It's no different than the UFO crazies whining that nobody takes them seriously, because they can't prove that anything they believe is true. This entire video has been nothing but ignorance on display and a desire for their feelings to be coddled. But that's not how reality works, is it? There's a reason that science works the way that it does. It's designed to separate the ideas that have intellectual merit from the ones that don't. It has high standards for good reasons, and it doesn't care about your fee-fees, nor should it. But that's not fair. That's not a valid reason to get your shot at the big time. You have to earn it, and whether they like it or not, the religious never have, and let's be honest, they never will. They haven't even tried. They need to get past their faith first. Faith is never going to get you anywhere remotely close to credibility, and if that's all you've got, as it clearly is when it comes to religion, then all the complaining and whining and stamping your feet in the world, that's not going to make a difference. You have to do better than that. You have to be better than that. It's really a shame that these people aren't, nor do they have any real interest in improving. And that's why religion will always fail, because they're just too dumb to do otherwise.